Today on MH News, we're taking behind the scenes. Welcome to MH News, everybody. I'm your host, Matt Haslam. Now today we're going behind the scenes of an interview we conducted this past week. It's one of about 30 interviews that we're conducting over the course of the next 2 weeks here. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's so much fun to conduct an interview and be a part of it, and we're so excited. So today we're taking behind the scenes to show you how to set up and conduct a professional interview. That way, in the end, you are recommended to other people. In the end, you look professional and you get great shots, most importantly, for your end final cut. So today, the first tip we have on any interview that you're conducting is to go to the location and see what you're dealing with. You don't want to just go there one day and just start setting up. You want to see what you're dealing with, see what kind of light is coming in the room. If there's a window nearby and you don't want sunlight to come in and help you out, if that's not the look you're looking for, in the end, you want to make sure you take enough black fabric to cover up that window. Luckily, we were at a library and I loved the entire location and how it was set up. There was no windows nearby where we were going to shoot because it was in the middle of the library. So first off, it's a very quiet location for us to use, and secondly, there was no windows around to have light coming in and would distract from the scene. So that was always a plus for this location. But what lighting is already there? So we already knew that there was fluorescent lighting in the ceiling installed, and that was great fluorescent lighting. It was actually wonderful for us, and it helped us out quite a bit, and that fluorescent light ended up being our back hair light for our interviewee. So it actually helped us out in the 3-point lighting system later on. But unfortunately, the fluorescent lights stopped about 6 feet away from our back wall, where you can see bookcases in the background there. It actually stopped about 6 feet away from that wall, so we ended up having to bring additional lights to light that backdrop up. But the next thing you want to do, once you see what you're dealing with, is you want to set up your camera about where you're going to have it for your interview. Now, this is because you don't want to go setting up a bunch of stands or a bunch of lights and stuff like that, and then figure out, oh, all these stands are in my shot, and I need to move them out of my shot. You also want to make sure your camera's set up. That way you can check it as you're setting up all your lighting and stuff like that. That way you can check your scene and go, is this light in the right position? Is it aimed the right way? Is there enough diffusion? So on and so forth. And that way you can check the intensity of every light to make sure your lighting is perfect. The next thing you want to do is set up the chair that your interviewee is going to sit in, or put a mark on the floor where they're going to stand. Now, if they're standing, you typically put a T with gaff tape on the floor, and that way each foot is on either side of that vertical line of the T, and that way they know exactly what direction they're aiming. Because if they're just, say, looking at a mark on the floor and an X on the floor, well, they're going to think they're supposed to stand there directly in front of the camera and look at the camera. But if you put a T on the ground and say, put your feet on each side of that line, well, now they know to aim in the direction of wherever you have that T pointing. So that's what we always do for if they're a standing interview. But for an interview with a chair or something like that, we're going to put gaff tape on the floor on each corner of the chair legs. That way, if for some reason the interviewee comes in and accidentally moves the chair, before we roll our footage for the interview, we're going to check that chair and make sure it's in the same position. That way our lighting and everything like that was already set up for where that chair was, well, it's not going to change anything. So make sure that chair is in the same position, and the best way to do that is put some gaff tape on the floor. As well as your tripod, you want to make sure that it's gaff taped on the floor to make sure you're always in the same spot. And that way if something moves, you can move it right back to the same position. If you have more than one camera, you don't really have to do the gaff tape, but if you want 2 different angles and you only have one camera that day, well, if you move your camera from this position to over here to get a second angle, well, then you're not going to be able to move it back to the same exact position without gaff tape on the floor. The next thing to do is set up your 3-point lighting system. Now, typically on a gig like this, we'll take with us our standard lighting kit, which consists of 2 Home Depot two Home Depot can lights with CFL bulbs, as well as a 2 foot by 2 foot softbox with diffusion and a CFL bulb on it. And we'll take all of that with us. And that's typically the smaller kit that we end up using for a lot of different things because it's very small. It can fit into a lot of different places. And it's a great little lighting kit that we end up using all the time, along with some light stands and a bunch of extension cords. Now, for our extension cords, we use Quad Box Pros. They're basically a box that you put into a wall receptacle, and it has 4 outlets on it, and it goes with a 20-foot extension cord or 50-foot extension cord out to plug in to one outlet. So it basically is a multi-strip and an extension cord combined into one, and they're fantastic to use all the time. With this interview, we knew that we already had a back hair light because of the fluorescent lighting was already in the room installed in the ceiling. So all we had to do was add a key light and a fill light, technically. So what we did was we added a can light from Home Depot with a CFL bulb as our key light, and that's a very harsh light because your key light is typically a very harsh light. There's no diffusion on that, so it becomes a more harsh light, and that's exactly what you want as a key light. And that's typically on your interviewee's right side over here, and that's exactly what we're using right now for this program. Then we have a 2 foot by 2 foot softbox with some diffusion on it, and that's on our interviewee's left side. And you want to make sure that they go out at about a 45-degree angle out from your actor, and just to make sure the lighting is all correct. And the next thing we did for this scene, because we already had a hair light with the fluorescent bulbs that were in the ceiling already, the next thing we did was added a backdrop light, because again, the back wall wasn't lit that well because the fluorescent light stopped about 6 feet away from the back wall. So we added some lighting back there with a backdrop light, actually clamped onto a bookshelf nearby, and that worked really great at adding more light to that backdrop. One of the main things you have to remember when you're doing lighting is to make sure before you put lights on your light stands and you attach those lights to the light stand, you make sure you put sandbags down first. When you put a stand down, put a sandbag on it immediately. That way you're not putting a light on and then walking away and the equipment falls over while you're trying to get a sandbag back to the stand. So one of the most important reasons this is important is because it's not going to fall on someone and get someone hurt, and secondly, it's not going to damage your equipment when it falls over. So make sure you put a sandbag down on that stand before you put the light on, and make sure when you put a light on your stand, make sure if your light is aiming in this direction, well, your sandbag has to be back here on the opposite corner. That way it weights it down from the back side. Another important thing to remember is wherever your light is actually aiming, make sure one of your legs to your stand is aiming in that same direction. That way if it falls over, it falls left or it falls right, and it's not falling on your interviewee. Next, check your camera constantly throughout your entire lighting process. So if you're setting up lights, make sure you're checking your camera monitors to make sure the intensity of those lights is correct and make sure the position is correct. That way you're not setting up a bunch of lights and then turning them on and going, wow, I have too much light, I need to turn everything down. Make sure you're setting up your lighting while you're constantly checking the monitors to make sure everything you're doing is perfect. Next, set up your microphone over top of that chair and aim it about where you think their mouth is going to be. But make sure you leave some extra XLR cable at the end of that boom stand near the mic, just to make sure you can adjust it a little bit back and forth when your interviewee actually comes in for the interview. One of the worst things you can do with XLR cables and microphones is pull on that cable and then the cable's ruined. So make sure you're setting it up to prepare yourself for having some extra XLR cable to use. And then finally bring in your interviewee and ask them to stay still for a minute. Just ask them to sit in their position and not move. That way you can frame up your camera, you can focus your camera completely, you can make sure all your lighting is correct and stuff like that. And typically the next thing I'll do is I'll get 30 seconds of silence. But while I'm getting this 30 seconds of silence, all my microphones, and I'll record 30 seconds completely blank, nobody talking, and Actually, it was in a library, so perfect little location to have a quiet little spot to interview. But we get 30 seconds of silence. But while we're doing that, rather than wasting time, we're also getting a slider shot. And I love to use sliders for interviews for one scene and one scene only. So I'll actually just slide my camera from left and right, back and forth a couple times, just to get some blank footage of the interviewee just sitting there. And that way, if for some unknown reason the footage doesn't look perfect from one of the scenes of the actual interview itself where they're talking, I can just take that little tiny scene of the slider scene and put it over top of their vocals and the audio. That way I can cut to that and it's almost like a B-roll shot. So make sure you always get 30 seconds of silence and just a blank shot of them on some sort of movement, some sort of camera slider. And finally, ask them to recite a couple lines from lyrics from their favorite song. If you're working with children, ask them to recite a couple lines from a nursery rhyme. That way you get a baseline for the audio. And make sure you're listening in on headphones and not just live, because live is a lot different than what your mics are actually picking up on. So use a pair of headphones and adjust your mic levels to make sure all your audio is perfect before you start rolling. One of the different things we did this time on this interview was the first 10 seconds of our footage wasn't that great because it wasn't in focus, and they weren't actually talking to them during that 10 seconds, so it ended up being okay. But basically you want to make sure everything is perfect before you start rolling your camera or your audio, just to make sure everything you get is usable. Next thing to do is use a clapboard. So many people try to do an interview without a clapboard, and it is just not that great in editing. You're going to have to use a program such as Pluralize, which is a very expensive program to use. So make sure you use a clapboard, and make sure on that clapboard during your interview you put their name in a scene number or something like that, what their name is, the correct spelling for their name. That way the editors don't have to look through the paperwork and make sure that spelling is right, because they're right there anyway. Ask them to spell their name for you, just to make sure your lower third on your editing is going to be perfect later on. And make sure on that to list what type of camera you're using. Typically I'll list the camera we're using, which is a T5i, and list the type of audio recorder we're using, which is a Zoom H4n, and I'll list the bit rate of the audio that we're recording, as well as the frames per second and the resolution of the camera, all on here. I'll also put the Kelvin temperature of the lighting that we're using, which is 3200 Kelvin right now because of CFL bulbs. So I'll list that color temperature just to make sure the editors have an easy job in coloring that footage later on. And I'll also put the date of the production. That way they know exactly when it was recorded. But make sure you use the clapboard. If you don't do that, they're going to have a huge problem in editing later on. That's our tips for an interview. If you have any questions, please send us a line at questions@mhnews.info. You can also comment below on Facebook or YouTube. And check out our brand new episodes every Monday and Thursday. Mondays are Q&As, and for a pretty long time here until I think the middle of June, we're going to be doing behind the scenes episodes every Thursday. So make sure you come back and check us out here at mhnews.info. Have a good one, people, and see us next time.